Ibrahima, and welcome everyone. And as Ibrahima said, Happy New Year to all of you. I hope this year is going to be one we can look forward to with uh, some changes in what's going on in the world. But uh, if anything, thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. and his contributions to humanity, hopefully will set us off in good stead. But what I want to talk about I'm going to give you a good overview of his life, of course. But we know King as the leader in the nonviolent approach to gaining full civil liberties and equality of opportunity for persons of color, particularly in the United States. What less appreciated, I think, is his broader concern to end the very existence of poverty. And so that will be the focus of my talk this evening. Well, where did King get his ideas? We know, well, I'm sorry. I think I hit the wrong button already. Bear with me a second. Okay, sorry about that. In his 1967 book titled Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, King was looking ahead to the day when racial discrimination was no longer tolerated. He knew this would not bring an end to poverty, that much more really had to be done. Well, part of his ideas about ending poverty evolved over several decades, and an unlikely association developed with a journalist turned congressional staffer named Walt Rybeck. It was really thanks to King's relationship with Walt that he was introduced to the ideas of Henry George. And in his autobiographical book titled Resolving the Economic Puzzle, Walt explains that Coretta Scott King was one of his closest friends while they were students at Antioch College. In Walt's own words, he wrote, "She was an aspiring singer before she married Martin Luther King Jr. Hearing her tell about the indignities her family suffered while she was growing up in Alabama was heartbreaking. Black churches around Ohio invited her to sing, and I went along as accompanist. Mixed race couples were seldom seen in those times. We were never physically harmed as we traveled, but if looks could kill. We were relieved to reach the churches where the audiences invariably received me with the same warmth as Coretta." Well, after college, Walt began what became a remarkable career as a journalist. He worked for the Dayton Daily News, and there he happened to come across and read Henry George's book, Progress and Poverty. He was soon drawn into the small community of Henry Georges scattered around the globe. Then, after John F. Kennedy became president, Walt was appointed to the Washington bureau chief for the Cox newspapers, which put him in the center of action, particularly in the center of action during the civil rights movement and in the environment where Martin Luther King Jr. was making his fame known. Now, how frequently Walt continued to see the Kings in subsequent years, he doesn't say in his book. He only mentions a 1965 luncheon following King's meeting with President Lyndon Johnson. What is clear is that thanks to Walt, King had come to understand that racism was only one cause of generational poverty. It was far from the only cause. Deep changes in the nation's economic system were called for. We had this long history in housing of redlining and racial prejudice, and King was convinced that the nation's economic system had to be changed fundamentally. There were many people of every race who were born into and remained in poverty all their lives. However, blacks seem to suffer from the worst institutional disadvantages. The history of land settlement offered a crucial insight into the effects on persons of color, as King observed. And here I'm hoping this is going to work. I have Martin Luther King's recording of this statement, and hopefully it'll come through.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today, many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. And this is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
In that short passage, King really succinctly describes the really destructive policy that the United States government and state governments and local governments inflicted on persons of color in this country. Not only on persons of color, but certainly to such a large extent that it kept those people from ever becoming fully experiencing their potential as individuals, as human beings. Now, with that, I'm going to go into a little bit of King's life. So if you don't already know it, this will give you a sense of where he came from and how his thinking evolved. He was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1929. He attended the Booker T. Washington High School until 1944. And then, although he had not formally graduated from his high school, he was admitted to Morehouse College. At Morehouse, King was introduced to the writings of Henry David Thoreau, and these had a lasting influence on the direction of his activism. He later wrote about his readings as follows. He said, "During my days, I read Henry David Thoreau's essay on civil disobedience for the first time. Here in this courageous New Englander's refusal to pay his taxes and his choice of jail rather than support a war that would spread slavery's territory into Mexico, I made my first contact with the theory of nonviolent resistance." He went on to graduate from Morehouse College in 1948 and thereafter entered the Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. And now, as a student at Crozer, King began to broaden his study of what might be called the great ideas. And about his time there, he wrote as follows. He says, "I turned to a serious study of the social and ethical theories of the great philosophers, from Plato and Aristotle down to Rousseau, Hobbes, Bentham, Mill, and Locke. All of these masters stimulated my thinking, such as it was, and while finding things to question in each of them, I nevertheless learned a great deal from their study." King then determined that he ought to learn something about the communist ideology. Certainly, this was an option that was being presented to persons of color and other minorities who were suffering indignities within the United States and other societies. So he read Das Kapital by Karl Marx, as well as the Communist Manifesto. But as a devout Christian, King rejected the communist interpretation of history. Thus, although he thought Marxist ideology to be without principle, and even evil in its fundamental nature, he acknowledged why others might embrace it as a path to escape from long-standing oppressions. And he comments on that as well here. Excuse me just a sec. He writes, with all of its false assumptions and evil methods, communism grew as a protest against the hardships of the underprivileged. Communism, in theory, emphasized a classless society and a concern for social justice, though the world knows from sad experience that in practice it created new classes and a new lexicon of injustice. Thus, to King, the Christian ought always to be challenged by any protest against unfair treatment of the poor. That, in his mind, was part of the Christian doctrine, part of what makes a person a true Christian. Importantly, he comes to the conclusion that capitalism as practiced was inherently unjust and in need of specific reforms. He expressed his concerns in this way. My reading of Marx also convinced me that truth is found neither in Marxism nor in traditional capitalism. Each represents a partial truth. Historically, capitalism failed to see the truth in collective enterprise, and Marxism failed to see the truth in individual enterprise. 19th century capitalism failed to see that life is social, and Marxism failed and still fails to see that life is individual and personal. Let me stop for just a second and ask if anyone has any comments or questions so far. Okay, seeing all is quiet, I'll continue. In Philadelphia, King then heard a sermon by Dr. Mordecai Johnson, president of Howard University, who spoke on his recent trip to India and the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. Well, Gandhi had a lot to say to King, particularly about the relationship between people and nature and about land. So King immersed himself into a study of Gandhi's life and his works. He came to embrace Gandhi's strategy of nonviolent resistance as the answer to the unfair treatment of persons of color that were still being practiced in the United States. Well, the question then arose, to what extent was King also influenced by Gandhi's views on reforms and how to end poverty? Gandhi was an agrarian, and he championed the cause of the landless peasants. He supported the outright confiscation of land from India's large landowners to be distributed free of charge to the poor. It was Gandhi's view that only those who actually worked the land should be permitted to own it. He wrote, "Land and all properties is his who will work it." So Gandhi obviously understood the evils of absentee land ownership and of the rentier privilege that existed in India and in other societies. Well, years later, King was able to travel to India to visit Gandhi's place of birth. And in a radio address made just before returning to the United States, here's what he said to the people of India. Since being in India, I am more convinced than ever before that the method of nonviolent resistance is the most potent weapon available to oppress people in their struggle for justice and dignity. In a real sense, Mahatma Gandhi embodied in his life certain universal principles that are inherent in the moral structure of the universe. And these principles are as inescapable as the law of gravitation. So you can see that King's philosophical framework is being broadened constantly. Early on by the studying of the great Western philosophers, now he's adding Gandhi to that frame of reference to give him his basis for his action going forward. In a November 1956 sermon, he presented an imaginary letter from the Apostle Paul to American Christians. And in this imaginary sermon, he says this: "O America, how often have you taken necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes? God never intended for one group of people to live in superfluous, inordinate wealth, while others live in abject, deadening poverty."
Ed, we are not seeing the slides.
Really?
Yes, you
What
want to
happened?
unload them again?
Did it get turned off somehow?
Somehow, I don't know how it happened.
All right, let me go back to the share mechanism and see what happened. How long has that been happening?
Just a minute ago, I would say.
Okay. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay. How
That's
did
what
that
it
happen?
says.
I don't know. My computer is very unstable. Let's do this. Okay, you want to try?
It still won't allow me to do so.
Okay.
Okay, it looks like it's now ready to allow us to go back to sharing. Okay. Can
Thanks.
you now see the screen?
Yes.
Okay. So that was from the sermon. And then the next slide goes to his speech in 1963, where he talked about the poverty that crossed the color line. And this is during this period where there was this giant march on Washington trying to make the case with our leading political figures that something had to be done to deal with the entrenched poverty that existed in the country. And here's what he said there: "To this day, the white poor also suffer deprivation and the humiliation of poverty, if not of color. It corrupts their lives, frustrates their opportunities, and withers their education. In one sense, it is more evil for them because it has confused so many by prejudice that they have supported their own oppressors." I think this is just a remarkably insightful observation that I would offer that this affects a lot of our politics today. It is amazing to me how people vote against their own basic interests, not really understanding what their votes are achieving for those that actually seek to oppress them, to keep them down, to keep them from enjoying some level of equality of opportunity in our society. And King saw that clearly. He asked some of the same moral questions raised by others regarding the treatment of nature as private property. And this is perhaps something that was in his mind from his association with Walt Riebeck. He says, "You see, my friends, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water?" Despite the history of how persons of color were subjected to centuries of unjust law, King looked to government to secure economic rights. The government had to change if that was going to be accomplished. He described capitalism as it existed as a system that permitting necessities to be taken from the many to give luxuries to the few. And certainly the statistics tell us today that the concentration of income and wealth in our society is increasing at an increasing rate. The reforms he sought were directed toward achieving what political economists described as a just distribution of wealth. Government needed to be pressured to secure and protect economic as well as political rights. As King put it in a 1965 speech to the Negro American Labor Council, the good and just society is neither the thesis of capitalism nor the antithesis of communism, but a socially conscious democracy which reconciles the truths of individualism and collectivism. Call it democracy or call it democratic socialism, but there must be a better distribution of wealth within this country for all God's children. King observed that in the world of 1963, persons of color were the last hired and the first to be let go, all the more so because of improvements in the efficiency of industrial machinery. He knew and observed that industrialization, automation, all of these processes were allowing us to produce greater and greater output with less and less input of labor. And so this left a major problem in a world where those who are least technically trained to fill these new positions were going to be left out. He writes, the nation will also have to find the answer to full employment, including a more imaginative approach than has yet been conceived for neutralizing the perils of automation. Today, as the skilled and semi-skilled Negro attempts to mount the ladder of economic security, he finds himself in competition with the white working man at the very time when automation is scrapping 40,000 jobs a week.
That is precisely the delusion which gripped the Inquisition 600 years ago. The notion that temptation could lead people away from the good and correct path, the only path on which they would flourish. But of course, that essentially denies the fundamental implications of free will. And within the specifically Christian context, it denies the implications of Jesus's perhaps most profound statement that my kingdom is not of this world. One conclusion from which might be that we need to pursue philosophical fidelity rather than those things which in this quotidian world might be to our greatest advantage. I spend a lot of time these days working on that particular notion, but I do feel that the great delusion of the educated of our time is the feeling that what separates them from the deplorables is that the deplorables are too easily tempted into working, acting, voting against their own best interests.
Yeah, let me interject that my sense is that it, particularly in the United States, when you talk about who is influenced by ideas that have a grain of truth but aren't perhaps fully truthful, it's everyone, every strata in society. That how many of us know people who have voted either Democrat or Republican in their family for generations, and how many of them really understand what the philosophy of the political party they're supporting really is? It's the same argument I would offer with regard to those who defend gun ownership by bringing the Second Amendment to the Constitution into the discussion without knowing what the Second Amendment of the Constitution says. I mean,
Ah,
Uh,
but there you get on very slippery ground. I wrote a very long piece about the Second Amendment explaining that it has very little to do with guns. It has to do with the nature of policing. It
well,
has to do with the very fact that there is no public police. There is no immunization of some sort of class of citizens who exercise police powers. That all policing in a democratic republic like these United States is done by a militia, that is, by volunteers who are subject to full joint and several liability before grand juries of their peers
well,
for everything.
that certainly was the case in the 17th and 18th centuries, where communities were dependent upon, members of the community to be prepared to defend the community, and therefore be prepared by having a weapon that they could bring with them, as well as provisions, a horse, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So those are, it seemed to me, responsibilities of being a member of the community. And we can, I'd love to have that conversation with you at some other time in more depth. But let me move on in our discussion of Martin Luther King, reminding everyone that his perspectives are based on his perception of what a Christian is and what a Christian ought to believe. Others may have a different view of what the doctrine of Christianity says to them in terms of individual behavior and individual responsibility. But that's a discussion that requires a lot more participation by people of different Christian feelings or beliefs than we're prepared to do tonight. Let me continue with what he had to say about what he expected of government and of the Lyndon Johnson administration at that time. He says, I propose specifically the creation of a national agency that shall provide a job to every person who needs work, young and old, white and Negro. I propose a job for everyone, not a promise to see if jobs can be found. And he continues, there cannot be social peace when a people have awakened to their rights and dignity and to the wretchedness of their lives simultaneously. If our government cannot create jobs, it cannot govern. It cannot have white affluence amid Black poverty and have racial harmony. Well, I think King really understood that without the opportunity to earn a decent living, the social conflicts would only escalate into political turmoil and violence, and that would threaten the very life of the democracy that was potentially the promise of the United States as a society, a promise certainly not yet fulfilled then or even today. Because the private sector had failed to deliver a full employment economy, King called upon the federal government then to fill the void. He adds this, he says, we must develop a federal program of public works, retraining, and jobs for all so that none, Black or white or Black, will have cause to feel threatened. At the present time, thousands of jobs a week are disappearing in the wake of automation and other efficiency techniques. In an article he wrote for the Saturday Review during 1965, he acknowledged that racial and economic problems in the northern states were far more serious than he had thought previously. His biographer, David Lewis, writes, the illusion of freedom in the North had masked its hideous economic conditions. Matriarchal families whose morality was vitiated by perpetual dependence upon welfare programs, levels of unemployment that had actually risen in the decades since Montgomery, and agglutinations of the impoverished in substandard housing that had few equivalents even in the South. Well, late in 1965, he arrives in Chicago to add strength to a coalition that was formed to take on Mayor Richard Daley and Chicago's very real racial and economic segregation. High on his list of priorities was the terrible condition of rental housing units available to Chicago's poor and persons of color. King could feel gratified to some degree when in August of 1966, Chicago officials announced that $500 million would be invested in 22 depressed areas of the city over the next couple of years. Moreover, after prolonged negotiations with Daley, an agreement was reached that promised an end to housing discrimination. I don't know what the current situation is in Chicago. I wonder if today it's as much racial or more economic in terms of discrimination, in terms of who lives in what neighborhoods. If anyone's from Chicago, maybe you can enlighten us on the current, situation there. Well, the methods learned from the Chicago campaign were significant, King wrote. People were activated and up in arms protesting about slum conditions, whether in poor white areas or for poor Black neighborhoods. So the nation was starting to develop a much stronger conscience, at least in certain parts of the nation. King said, "For years, I labored with the idea of reforming the existing institutions of the society. A little change here, a little change there. Now I feel quite differently. I think you've got to have a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of values." Under circumstances of widespread discrimination in labor markets that faced persons of color, they had little hope of better pay and working conditions. So King felt that unionization was one of the few responses that was available to them. He wrote, "Where Negroes are confined to the lowest paying jobs, they must get together to organize a union in order to have the kind of power that could enter into collective bargaining with their employers." His final book is also a statement of positions on raising the living standards of the poor among his fellow citizens. And again, it was titled, "Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community?" And again, gets back to his basic theme of full employment. He says, "We must create full employment or we must create incomes." I'll read that again because it's an important statement. I'm going to go into a little bit more. We must create full employment or we must create incomes. People must be made consumers by one method or the other. We realize that dislocations in the market operation of our economy and the prevalence of discrimination thrust people into idleness and bind them in constant or frequent unemployment against their will. What King understood, I think, is that the existing system never achieved full employment. Not in the 19th century, not in the 20th century, certainly not in the 21st century. Even without bigotry and prejudice, there would always be a large number of people left outside the mainstream. Faced with the same observation, the economist Milton Friedman argued for a negative income tax as a means of enabling people to obtain necessary goods with the minimum involvement of social engineering and government bureaucracy. In 1968, Friedman answered William F. Buckley Jr. on the merits of this proposal as follows. The proposal for a negative income tax is a proposal to help poor people by giving them money, which is what they need, rather than, as is now, by requiring them to come before a governmental official, detail all their assets and liabilities, and be told, you can spend X dollars on rent, Y dollars on food, etc., and then be given a handout. Economic expansion alone cannot do the job of improving the employment situation of Negroes. It provides the base for employment, but other things must be constructed upon it, especially if the tragic situation of youth is to be solved. In a booming economy, Negro youth are afflicted with unemployment as though in an economic crisis. They are the explosive outsiders of the American expansion. So let me stop just a second and ask if you have any sympathy for this idea of a negative income tax and for giving people an income supplement, the universal income kind of program. Was Friedman
Absolutely,
right?
and he was, and Henry George advocates for it too. So yeah, absolutely, I support it.
Anyone
I
else?
didn't initially,
They didn't initially because
because to try and introduce that with the tax changes that Henry George was arguing for, all in one hit would probably be too much for the population. But if you could go back to slide 62, you're on 69 now. I missed slide 62, but that will give you the reason why. Are you able to do that?
yeah, give me a second to get back.
I'll just grab that. So this is what Martin Luther King figured out after a while. A little change here, a little change there. That is, incremental reforms were the way to go. But then he came to a different conclusion. I think you've got to have a reconstruction of the entire society, a revolution of value. In other words, what he was talking about there is a big bang reform. So rather than just try to incrementally shift your taxes to increase the proportion of taxes on rent and decrease the burden of taxes on income, I feel it's better to go the way Martin Luther King has decided to go here, in that a holistic approach needs to be made. In other words, not only a tax shift, but a UBI introduced at the same time. And if done correctly, Georgists can attract a lot more support for their tax shift by offering free money. I mean, who's going to argue with that? Provided that a whole suite of reforms are brought in one go. Big bang reform, and I'm pleased to see that Martin Luther King came to the same conclusion as to the way forward.
The issue you raise is a complex one because of the concerns that are often raised about the chaos that this would create in the short run. Upsetment of long-standing property relationships. I'm not arguing against it per se. It's a question of the plan of implementation and how whether or not the law of unforeseen consequences can be, tamed, so that when we make some of these changes, if we're able to get the political support to do so, that can be done so that there aren't adverse effects on people who are most at risk of being adversely affected. I have my own thoughts on this, Anthony, about how to do it and what would move us in that direction, perhaps not immediately. And we'll have to have another session to talk about that, specifically. But
yes, for sure.
But
there's a lot in it, and I won't hijack your show talking about it now.
Anyone else have any thoughts about that, about the effectiveness of a negative income tax or a universal basic income supplement? Dylan.
Ed, do you know of any research about if it is more effective just to put money into people's pockets rather than to use taxpayer dollars for like mental health services and these institutions. Yeah, do you have any research about if it's better for people just to get the money instead?
I've read a couple of papers. I have a few on my computer, but I I don't, based on what I've read, um, this is a real, it's an issue because you have to look at the segments of the population you're talking about to see what effect this has on them. Are you talking about the non-working poor? Or are you talking about the working poor? Are you talking about individuals who are physically or mentally handicapped? There's, so the effect of giving people money is not necessarily going to be equal. Like a universal basic income distribution is going to have different distributional effects on different segments of the population.
Understood.
But again, I think it's worthy of a lot more discussion, and we should think about having a session on that at some future date. Joe, Polito.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
We live in a world where there are shortages of things, primarily resources, land, labor, and capital. And the allocation of money to people means an allocation of resources. So I'm not particularly in favor of UBI unless it's essential. Sometimes people don't have the funds to for food and so forth, but I think that money should be used to be allocated to the highest priority goods and services. So healthcare, education, infrastructure, housing, food, etc. And if we are allocating those resources to the highest priorities, it should create a shortage of jobs, shortage of labor.
Yes.
And that would be my first choice. But I would, if people are in dire need and we weren't able to mobilize all the resources like we should, then I would, as a last resort, give money for absolute necessities. Great presentation today, by the way.
Again, wouldn't it be great if Martin Luther King Jr. was still alive to discuss this with us? Now he's dealing with the situation as it exists in the mid 1960s. And certainly at that time, there was a very small Black middle class, a very small Black upper middle class, and quote, Black institutions were not sufficiently endowed with resources as many are today to have a real impact on those at the bottom of our society. And yet, even with that progress, again, we're still facing this problem of the bottom half of our working population is losing purchasing power on a daily basis to inflation and to the competition that exists for capital investment from around the world. And we in the United States are trying to respond. Our producers are trying to respond. Our politicians are trying to respond, trying to figure out how to create something closer to a full employment society while increasing our ability to produce goods and services. And labor is constantly the victim because labor, it costs a lot of money to employ people, and you have benefit packages and this still hasn't been worked out. So
Ed, can I add something?
Yeah.
I believe King was influenced by Sadie Alexander. She was the first Black economist, and she had a relationship with the Roosevelts as well. And she promoted this notion of a job guarantee to them, and that came through in Roosevelt's 1944 State of the Union address. He talked about a living wage job for all. And she promoted that kind of thinking with King as well.
Yeah.
So I think
It didn't make it to in the Truman administration after the Second World War. The best they came up with was a commitment, not to guarantee full employment, but a commitment to work toward it. And
right.
so getting back to where he was at the time, and I'll try to put this into a little bit of a historical perspective as I see it evolving. So King is looking at his world as a world where, whoops, we had some kind of a serious problem, echo problem. Anyway, he's looking at a world where people have largely left the land to work in the cities. And certainly with the Second World War, that was the case with persons of color from the South moving to the cities in the North and creating opportunity, but also a lot of conflict, racial conflict, and conflict between working class whites and blacks. As he observes, the problems have always been a lot more acute in the sections of our cities where those neighborhoods are predominantly poor households. People are living at the margin, and the tensions are obviously greater. And of course, in many cities, the number of African Americans living in sections with few employers has always been the greatest. So those who left the agricultural sections of the country, who might have been sharecroppers, came to the cities to live and work, continuing to be sharecroppers, but with a different sort of landlord, the slumlord, the absentee owner of tenements. Adults found their way into low-wage jobs, but the unskilled youth were simply left out altogether. And this is something that really worried Martin Luther King Jr. about what was going to happen to the young. He writes, depressed living standards for Negroes are not simply the consequence of neglect, nor can they be explained by the myth of the Negro's innate incapacities or by more sophisticated rationalization of his acquired infirmities, family disorganization, poor education, etc. They are a structural part of the economic system of the United States. Certain industries are based on a supply of low-paid, underskilled, and immobile non-white labor. So the challenge that he saw was to identify the structural flaws in the nation's economic system and press for changes in law. Now, many of us who are joining me tonight, are familiar with Henry George's, program. And we believe strongly that what Henry George offered the world were systemic reforms, and that had they been adopted, a lot of this discussion might have, not taken place because the problems would have been solved. For the poor living in American cities, however, few owned any land or even a house. And as I have just stated, in a very real sense, they were and are urban sharecroppers, sharing a good portion of their wages, what they earned, even though those wages might not be substantial, with the landlords owning the properties where they had to find a place of residence. In his famous April 1967 speech at the Riverside Church in New York City, he made a damning indictment of a budgetary imbalance that continues to this day. The one we are struggling with, of course, with how to resolve. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And toward the end of his book, he adds this: I am now convinced that the simplest approach will prove to be the most effective. The solution to poverty is to abolish it directly by a now widely discussed measure, the guaranteed income. And that's the final stage in his thinking. The problem with this measure, I've mentioned this before, and I think some of you are already in agreement with me. The problem is similar to the negative income tax proposed by Milton Friedman. Now, King can be forgiven for failing to see the outcome. I think Friedman, the economist, should have thought through the issue more thoroughly. Increase the household incomes broadly without increasing the supply of housing, and most of the increase in disposable income ends up in the pockets of landlords. This is just the way our system operates today because of the undertaxation of land and the overtaxation of housing and other property improvements. At minimum, government would need to construct millions of new housing units priced to be affordable to lower income households and kept affordable by government mandate. That, I see, is the big weakness of the universal basic income, that it will end up resulting in higher rents and higher costs of housing for low and moderate income households. By the time King writes his final book, a large portion of the residential sections of many U.S. cities look like this. They were crumbling from age and neglect. Housing that was built in the early 1900s, meant to last 25 or 30 years, was still being occupied, 70 or 80 years later, and without the kind of investment in ongoing maintenance and systems replacement that's required to keep a property, and functional use. Well, King was working hard to get people to Washington in 1968. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference initiated the Poor People's Campaign, and King stood with them there. As he prepared to join their march on Washington, he added his voice to those calling for an economic Bill of Rights. Again, he called for guaranteed employment for all willing and able to work, a living income for those not able to work, and an end to discrimination in the access to decent, affordable housing, as well as the integration of the nation's schools. In Richard Leisher's 1995 biography titled The Preacher King, here's what Leisher says about King's ideas. Martin Luther King was the last of the great liberals in America to identify the purposes of social reform with those of Christianity. He routinely cast the struggle for civil rights in terms of light and darkness, good and evil, and the two kingdoms. In an article in Look magazine just after he was murdered, he wrote this: "We call our demonstration a campaign for jobs and income because we feel that the economic question is the most crucial that Black people and poor people generally are confronting. There is a literal depression in the Negro community. When you have mass unemployment in the Negro community, it is called a social problem. When you have mass unemployment in the white community, it's called a depression. The fact is, there is a major depression in the Negro community. The unemployment rate is extremely high, and among Negro youth, it goes up as high as 40% in some cities. I don't know what the current statistics are, but I'm sure that the unemployment rate among Negro Black youth, persons of youth of color, is probably higher than white, but maybe someone else knows that for sure. So, to summarize what I believe I've learned in this examination of King's positions on how to deal with poverty, he believed the government is there to ensure that all persons have access to what the philosopher Mortimer Adler called the goods of a decent human existence. In his experience, the system almost everyone chooses to call capitalism fails to deliver the goods. Therefore, the system had to be changed, and government had to intervene on behalf of those at the margin. King embraced democracy, but a social democracy distinct from social Darwinism defended by some who stand right of center. Unfortunately, like most of his contemporaries who cared deeply about ending poverty, he apparently did not fully grasp the extent to which privilege dictates economic outcomes in our country, or perhaps more accurately, he had not yet recognized some of the most powerful forms of entrenched privilege that plague our society. To be sure, I think his struggles help to lessen privilege based on race or the color of one's skin. We see that, across our society today. Every day we observe how other forms of privilege continue to threaten our very democracy and stand in the way of a society built on equality of opportunity. As have many before and since, Martin Luther King Jr. gave his life in an effort to help change the course of history. And so the struggle continues, and to some has even intensified in the years of King's life and since his death. And with that, I end and open up to discussion and your thoughts, your reactions, and your sense of where we are and where we are headed in the future.
Thanks, Ed. That was a good parallel of King and George. To get back to the incrementalist approach versus the revolutionary or Big Bang reform, and the effect of a UBI on land values. Of course, in the suite of packages, suite of reforms that I mentioned, there's a UBI, and there is also land tax, George, tax on rent, because you're exactly correct. Feeding a UBI into society, it'll just go straight to the land. So you need to introduce those together. A UBI is just the wrong way to go as a standalone. And a lot of the reforms a suite of reforms is what's required, a holistic approach. It's not just tax, it's not just UBI. There are other things like public funding, for example. Governments should not need to borrow money. The money power exists in Australia, the federal government. It can just spend money. So the borrowing of money there needs to stop. Banks need to stop lending into housing in such a great detail, because every time they lend, money is created and it gets squirted straight into the housing sector. That forces up the prices. So the suite of reforms need to be enacted.
Broad and deep.
Of course,
It needs to be broad and deep.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just.
Of course, there is a transition period.
Well, and we in the United States also have other issues to deal with politically. How our elected representatives get into office, and their dependence on huge campaign contributions from the moneyed interests in our society. The number of lobbyists that exists, in Washington, D.C. and in the state legislatures far exceeds anything close to people representing the public good, the public interest. I don't know how bad it is in Australia, but I assume it's similar. Ibrahima, you had your hand up and you wanted to join in this conversation.
Yes, Ed, thank you very much. That was a very enlightening lecture. You did mention that King was in favor of UBI. Actually, he's one of the people whose name come whenever the debate on UBI is mentioned. I was wondering if anywhere in his writing or his speeches, did he ever outline a mechanism for funding the UBI that he was calling for?
He was in favor of progressive income taxation.
Okay. Thank you.
And I don't know, in the final book, there is some discussion of this, but in his other writings, he also mentioned he thought that corporations should be taxed more significantly than they had been. Now, what I'd like to know, but I don't recall reading anything in his writings, if he was supportive of cooperative enterprise in worker co-ops and that kind of thing. I have to do a little bit more research to find out if he ever wrote in favor of co-ops.
Thank you, Ed.
So, Walter?
To Ibrahimo's point, that's precisely where we as Georgists or as aspiring Georgists need to look at the weakness of taxing either capital or labor and look only to the efficacy of taxing land. I mean, King, of course, was a creature of his time, but the notion that you can tax capital in a world where capital can flee simply has proved over the last 50 years to be unworkable. The one thing that can't flee is land, as George understood. Labor can go where it is best treated. Capital can go where it is best treated. Land is fixed. And the only way you're going to get to any sort of equitable system of taxation, UBI or not, is by making the sole focus of your taxation the land which can't flee your jurisdiction.
Well, you've opened the door, and so I'm going to step in briefly, and then I'll let you have the floor, but I want to respond just by saying, ultimately, it would be great if rent from all of its sources was publicly captured. And a good study on the various sources of rent to be captured is by Mason Gaffney, the Georgist economist from the University of California. He wrote extensively on this, identified well over a dozen or 15 sources of rents that ought to be publicly captured. But we do need some sort of a transitional, incremental change in our tax system, in addition to what most local advocates have been working on for the last century, and that is the two-rate form of property tax, a shift toward land values. And my view is that the way to get there is a progressive income tax. And my definition of what I mean by progressive income tax is a progressive rate of taxation on unearned gains in the sale of assets. So if I was able to draft a bill for consideration in the United States, I would say all income from all sources should be reported and not be distinguished, and start with exempting all individual incomes up to the national median, which means that people who are dependent on working for a living and on retirement would largely be exempt from having to pay any income tax, at least at the federal level, and then eliminate all other exemptions and deductions, and above that, apply an increasing rate of taxation on higher ranges of income. I would personally have no problem with a 90% marginal tax rate on incomes over, let's say, $100 million. It certainly would not affect the individual's lifestyle or their ability to pay, and it would, in my view, it would amount to a reparation against what has been going on for the last, 100 years or so.
But as a practical matter, it will mean that that income is captured in Ireland.
Perhaps so, Walter. We'll have to discuss that in the future. But remember, you opened the door for me. Brian, you're muted.
Thank you for the presentation tonight. I'm a big fan of Dr. King and Gandhi, and trying to apply nonviolence to our political systems. You mentioned his book, Chaos or Community, and he's got my favorite quote here is the one sentence: Our nettlesome task is to discover how to organize our strength into compelling power so the government cannot elude our demands. And you've touched on this in a couple different ways tonight, talking about people voting against their interests, and so the solution is exactly what he was fighting for when he was assassinated, which is unionizing as swing voters across the country to make it so that the government can't elude our demands, and crowdsourcing the legislative process. You talked about what you would do if you could write a piece of legislation. And you can. We have a lot of smart people in this country who can do the work of Congress better than they can, since they're not doing anything at all, and they're corrupt. So,
Well, you are familiar with ALEC. You know
yeah.
what that ALEC is, the lobbying entity for corporations that writes almost all the legislation that comes to the Congress. So we need a public interest entity that has that same kind of power. Even in the United States, for those of us over of retirement age and older, we have ARP and American Association of Retired Persons, and they work on these issues too. But I don't know how we reach critical mass of constructive public unity to get the kind of laws that are necessary.
And I'm very familiar with ALEC. I used to serve in the state legislature for a number of years, and they brought lots of bills before us. And the answer is how to get a critical mass is because swing voters, a union of swing voters, it just takes a small percentage to control the national balance of power in Washington, D.C. So I dropped a link in the chat to my Substack and how we can apply Dr. King's 6 principles of nonviolence to our political system if anyone's interested in learning.
Great. Thanks for your comments, and thanks for coming out tonight. Joe, you have another comment you'd like to add or question?
Well, I'd like to support your expansion of the taxes idea.
Well, I appreciate that. There's two of us.
But I would say I would start with just commercial real estate sales, and eliminate the capital gains rates, the preferences. It would just be, just as you described, straight income. Let me tax that way.
I think simplicity requires us to not distinguish between the sources of income, because we know that at the higher levels of individual income, it's primarily from passive investment or speculation. And for those people who actually earn, through performance, earn $100 million, I think that they can well afford to contribute to the social welfare issues to solving the social welfare issues that we have that are so long standing. I remember Warren Buffett once said, I could never have done what I've done in another country. It is the institutions of the United States that enabled me to do what I've done and to become as wealthy as I've done. And so I have this obligation, to give back because of the benefits that I've enjoyed. And at a far lower level, I certainly feel the same way.
Thank you.
Anyone else have some thoughts about Martin Luther King Jr. and his crusade, about where we stand today? Have we made significant progress? Are we going backward? Well, I don't want to keep you any longer. So I thank you all for coming. I hope you've gained some insight into Martin Luther King Jr.'s thought process and what he proposed that we ought to do. You may or may not agree with him, but certainly he thought deeply about this, and he studied hard to get perspectives that perhaps we wish some of our leaders today would take the time to learn as well. So Ibrahima, would you like to close out the evening?
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you all for coming. This was a fantastic lecture, and I would like to let you know that we have a couple of interesting programs coming up. So please feel free to visit our website and enroll if you haven't done so already. Thank you and good night.